People love to argue about age gap relationships. Too old, too young, gold digger, midlife crisis. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to admit. Age doesn't destroy relationships, immaturity does. Some age gap relationships fail miserably, others work beautifully. So, what actually decides the outcome? Let's talk about the psychology behind age gap relationships without judgment, without fantasy, and without lies. Age gap isn't the problem, emotional gap is. People obsess over numbers because numbers are easy to judge, easy to gossip about, and easy to turn into headlines. A 10-year gap, a 15-year gap, a 20-year gap. These figures trigger instant opinions, but they reveal nothing about how two people actually function together. What truly determines whether a relationship thrives or collapses is emotional alignment. Emotional maturity, emotional responsibility, emotional awareness. These are invisible qualities, and because they're invisible, most people ignore them. Yet they silently decide everything: how conflict is handled, how needs are expressed, how power is shared, and how love survives stress. An emotional gap shows up when one person has learned how to regulate their feelings while the other still reacts impulsively. One knows how to communicate discomfort calmly, the other withdraws, explodes, or manipulates. In such dynamics, age becomes irrelevant because even two people of the same age can be emotionally worlds apart. The older partner may assume authority simply because of life experience, while the younger partner may surrender autonomy without realizing it. Over time, this creates an unspoken hierarchy, not based on wisdom, but on who feels more secure internally. Many emotionally uneven relationships look functional on the surface. There is attraction, affection, even loyalty, but underneath, one person carries the emotional labor while the other consumes it. One explains, reassures, plans, and stabilizes. The other reacts, doubts, and leans. This imbalance slowly erodes intimacy. Love begins to feel like responsibility, and admiration quietly turns into resentment. When emotional growth is one-sided, the relationship stops being a partnership and starts resembling a role. The emotional gap becomes most visible during conflict. Disagreements don't stay about the issue at hand. They turn into power struggles. One partner uses silence, guilt, or logic as a weapon, while the other responds with insecurity or compliance. Growth becomes impossible because the relationship is no longer a space for mutual evolution. It becomes a space for emotional survival. Age differences often amplify this gap because society already assigns authority to one side, making it harder for the emotionally less developed partner to find their voice. What people often mistake for chemistry in age gap relationships is emotional contrast. Confidence looks attractive to insecurity. Stability looks magnetic to chaos. But attraction rooted in imbalance cannot sustain intimacy. When one person depends on the other for emotional grounding, identity, or validation, love becomes conditional. The relationship survives only as long as the emotional hierarchy remains intact. The real danger of an emotional gap is that it prevents both people from growing authentically. The emotionally advanced partner stagnates, while the other never learns to stand on their own emotional feet. Over time, both lose parts of themselves, one through exhaustion, the other through dependence. Age does not create this damage. Emotional disparity does. Power imbalance matters more than numbers because relationships are not lived on a calendar. They are lived in daily exchanges of control, influence, and decision-making. Two people can be decades apart in age and still stand on equal ground, while two people born the same year can exist in a deeply unequal dynamic. Power shows up in who decides what matters, whose emotions set the tone of the relationship, and who adapts while the other remains fixed. When one partner consistently holds more leverage, emotional, financial, psychological, or social, the relationship quietly shifts from connection to control. The partner with less power begins to doubt their instincts, silence their discomfort, and shape themselves to fit the expectations of the one who holds authority. This isn't partnership, it's hierarchy, disguised as love. In age gap relationships, power is frequently assumed rather than discussed. The older partner is expected to lead, to know better, to decide. The younger partner is expected to learn, to follow, to adjust. These roles may feel natural at first, even comforting, but when power is unbalanced, disagreement becomes risky. Saying no feels like ingratitude. Expressing needs feels like asking for permission. Over time, the relationship stops being a space for mutual honesty and becomes a space for emotional negotiation. Financial control is one of the most overlooked forms of power imbalance. When one person funds the lifestyle, choices become conditional. Where to live, how to spend time, what standards to accept, all subtly orbit around the person with resources. Even without explicit rules, the power dynamic is felt. Gratitude replaces equality. Security replaces freedom. Love becomes intertwined with fear of loss, and that fear shapes behavior more than affection ever could. Emotional power can be even more damaging than financial power. The partner who is more emotionally stable, articulate, or self-assured often becomes the regulator of the relationship. Their moods dictate safety. Their approval becomes currency. The less secure partner works harder to maintain harmony, often at the expense of their own emotional truth. Doesn't always look cruel or obvious. It can exist in calm homes, polite conversations, and outwardly successful relationships. But beneath the surface, one person is shrinking while the other expands. Decisions feel one-sided. Growth feels restricted. Autonomy feels negotiable. When power is uneven, love loses its freedom. And without freedom, connection slowly turns into compliance. Men often seek youth. Women often seek stability, not because of shallow desire, but because of deeply ingrained psychological patterns shaped by biology, culture, and personal experience. Youth is often associated with vitality, openness, and possibility. It represents a sense of renewal, admiration, and emotional responsiveness that many men find validating. Stability, on the other hand, represents safety, consistency, and emotional grounding. It signals reliability and foresight, qualities many women are drawn to when thinking beyond attraction and toward long-term security. For many men, youth feels like affirmation. It reflects desirability, relevance, and success. Being chosen by someone younger can feed a sense of competence and worth, especially in a world that often ties male value to status and achievement. Youth also carries fewer expectations of emotional depth, accountability, or emotional confrontation, which can feel easier for men who are still developing emotional awareness. This doesn't mean men seek youth to avoid responsibility, but it does mean that youth can feel less demanding, more admiring, and less critical. For many women, stability feels like safety. Emotional steadiness, financial consistency, and life direction create a sense of predictability in an otherwise uncertain world. Stability offers reassurance that emotions will be held, needs will be met, and the future will not feel chaotic. Women are often socialized to think ahead, to assess risk, and to value reliability over impulse. As a result, stability becomes deeply attractive, not as a transaction, but as a foundation for trust and emotional investment. These preferences, however, become problematic when they replace self-development. When men seek youth to escape emotional growth, they risk entering relationships where admiration substitutes intimacy. When women seek stability to avoid uncertainty or self-trust, they risk surrendering autonomy for security. In both cases, attraction is driven by lack rather than choice. The relationship begins to compensate for something missing rather than enhance something already whole. Over time, these dynamics can create silent tension. Youth matures, stability ages. The qualities that once felt complementary can start to clash. The younger partner may grow into independence and assertiveness, while the older partner may resist change to preserve control or comfort. What once felt like protection can start to feel restrictive. What once felt like admiration can start to feel conditional. The danger lies not in the preference itself, but in the unconscious expectation that the other person will remain frozen in the role that made them desirable. Youth is expected to stay pliable. Stability is expected to stay unshaken. But people evolve, and when growth disrupts the original balance, unresolved fears surface. In such relationships, love is tested not by age, but by whether both individuals are allowed to outgrow the reasons they were chosen. Unhealed trauma attracts unequal dynamics because trauma reshapes how people understand safety, connection, and self-worth. When emotional wounds remain unresolved, relationships stop being a space for mutual growth and start becoming a place to reenact familiar pain. Trauma pulls people toward dynamics that feel known, not healthy. The nervous system mistakes intensity for intimacy and control for care. In this state, imbalance feels normal, even comforting, because it mirrors earlier experiences where love and instability were intertwined. People carrying unhealed trauma often confuse emotional intensity with depth. Strong reactions, dramatic highs and lows, or powerful attachment can feel like proof of connection. In reality, these patterns often signal dysregulation. Trauma bonds form when one person seeks validation, rescue, or approval, while the other unconsciously accepts a dominant role. The relationship becomes organized around fear of abandonment rather than genuine compatibility. One partner adapts constantly to maintain closeness, while the other sets the emotional temperature. Unequal dynamics thrive when boundaries were never safely learned. Someone who grew up having to earn love may enter relationships ready to overgive, over-explain, and self-abandon. Another person, often carrying their own unresolved wounds, may step into the role of authority, protector, or emotional gatekeeper. This pairing feels functional at first because each person's trauma finds a role. One feels needed, the other feels secure, but security built on imbalance is fragile and conditional. Unequal dynamics are reinforced when trauma prevents emotional accountability. The person with more power may avoid vulnerability by staying in control, while the other avoids conflict by staying agreeable. Neither feels safe enough to be fully seen. Growth becomes threatening because it destabilizes the roles that keep the relationship intact. Healing would require renegotiating power, and that often feels more dangerous than staying stuck. The most painful aspect of trauma-driven relationships is how convincing they feel. They are intense, magnetic, and deeply emotional. But intensity is not intimacy, and attachment is not connection. Trauma pulls people into roles, not partnerships. Until the underlying wounds are addressed, relationships continue to mirror imbalance, not because people want dysfunction, but because their nervous systems are still searching for familiarity instead of safety. Unhealed trauma attracts unequal dynamics because trauma quietly rewires how a person experiences closeness, authority, and belonging. When emotional wounds remain unresolved, relationships are no longer chosen freely. They are entered through patterns learned in survival. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. As a result, people don't gravitate toward equality. They gravitate toward what their nervous system recognizes as love, even if that recognition was formed in instability, neglect, or control. Trauma often creates a distorted sense of worth. Someone who learned early that love had to be earned may unconsciously place others above themselves. They may tolerate dismissiveness, emotional distance, or dominance because it mirrors an old dynamic where their needs were secondary. In these relationships, one person adapts excessively while the other occupies more space. The imbalance doesn't feel wrong at first. It feels normal. Safety is confused with endurance, and loyalty is confused with self-erasure. Unequal dynamics also emerge when trauma shapes identity around roles. One person becomes the caretaker, the fixer, the one who holds everything together. The other becomes the decider, the authority, the emotional reference point. These roles create a sense of purpose, but they prevent reciprocity. The caretaker feels valued only when needed. The dominant partner feels secure only when in control. Both are trapped in positions that protect their wounds rather than heal them. Trauma bonds intensify these patterns. Emotional inconsistency, withdrawal, and sudden affection create a cycle of anxiety and relief that feels addictive. The partner with less power works harder to regain closeness, often blaming themselves when distance appears. The partner with more power becomes the regulator of connection, sometimes unconsciously. This imbalance deepens because fear strengthens attachment. The more unstable the bond, the harder it is to leave. Unhealed trauma also weakens boundaries. Saying no feels dangerous. Expressing needs feels like a risk. Disagreement feels like abandonment. In this environment, power tilts naturally toward the person who is less afraid of loss. They speak more freely, demand more confidently, and withdraw without panic. The other learns to accommodate, negotiate, and anticipate moods. Over time, the relationship becomes structured around one person's comfort and the other's compliance. What makes trauma-driven inequality so persistent is how convincing it feels. There is passion, intensity, and emotional depth. Outsiders may see closeness, but internally, one person is shrinking to maintain connection. Growth becomes threatening because it disrupts the dynamic that keeps the bond intact. Healing would require rebalancing power, and for someone shaped by trauma, imbalance often feels safer than equality. Social judgment hurts more than the relationship itself because human beings are not built to exist in isolation. Even the strongest relationships live inside a social environment that constantly mirrors approval or disapproval back to us. When a relationship attracts criticism, whispers, or public scrutiny, the pressure doesn't just stay external. It seeps into self-perception, self-trust, and emotional safety. What may begin as a private bond slowly becomes something that must be defended, justified, or hidden. Judgment turns intimacy into performance. Instead of focusing on connection, partners become hyper-aware of how they are seen. Every interaction feels observed. Every choice feels evaluated. This creates a low-level tension that rarely gets acknowledged. People start to question their own experiences, not because something feels wrong, but because others insist it should. Doubt enters quietly, often disguised as logic or concern. Over time, the relationship absorbs stress that did not originate from within it. Social judgment also isolates. Friends become cautious. Family opinions grow louder. Support systems weaken just when they are most needed. The couple may feel forced into an us versus them dynamic, which can feel bonding at first, but eventually becomes exhausting. Constantly defending love drains emotional energy. It shifts focus away from growth and towards survival. Even healthy communication begins to feel heavy under the weight of external pressure. The most damaging aspect of judgment is internalization. When criticism is repeated often enough, it becomes a voice inside the relationship. Partners begin monitoring themselves, suppressing joy, or overcompensating to prove legitimacy. Moments that should feel natural become self-conscious. Love starts negotiating with shame. What once felt chosen begins to feel conditional, as though approval must be earned rather than assumed. Judgment also distorts conflict. Normal disagreements become evidence in the eyes of others. A single argument feels magnified, confirming every warning and stereotype. This creates pressure to appear perfect, which leaves no room for honest struggle. Problems go unspoken. Vulnerability feels risky. The relationship becomes quieter, not because it is peaceful, but because it is being watched. Often, the relationship itself is not what breaks people down. It is the constant reminder that they are being evaluated, measured, and discussed. The emotional labor of existing under scrutiny can outweigh any internal challenges the couple faces. Love is not only about connection between two people. It is also about whether that connection is allowed to exist without punishment. When judgment becomes relentless, it shapes the relationship more powerfully than the partners ever do. Long-term success depends on emotional maturity, not age, because time alone does not teach someone how to love well. Years pass regardless of whether emotional skills are learned or avoided. Emotional maturity is developed through self-awareness, accountability, and the willingness to reflect, not through birthdays or life milestones. Two people can enter a relationship decades apart in age and still meet each other with equal emotional presence, while two people the same age can remain stuck in patterns of defensiveness, avoidance, and unmet needs. Emotional maturity shows itself in how individuals respond to discomfort. Mature partners do not panic when faced with conflict, nor do they rush to control outcomes. They can tolerate disagreement without threatening withdrawal or punishment. They listen without immediately defending their ego. This capacity creates safety, which allows intimacy to deepen over time. Without emotional maturity, even minor misunderstandings become destabilizing, and unresolved tension quietly accumulates beneath the surface. Age often creates assumptions about wisdom and authority, but these assumptions are unreliable. Experience does not automatically translate into emotional competence. Someone may have lived through many relationships without learning how to communicate honestly, repair trust, or regulate emotions. Emotional immaturity often hides behind confidence, charisma, or certainty. It reveals itself in rigidity, blame, and an inability to self-correct. Over time, these traits erode connection far more than any age difference ever could. In long-term relationships, growth is inevitable. Desires shift, priorities change. Emotional maturity determines whether partners can evolve together or become threatened by each other's development. Mature individuals allow space for change without interpreting it as rejection. They can renegotiate roles, expectations, and boundaries without needing to dominate or retreat. Immature dynamics, by contrast, resist change because they rely on fixed roles to maintain a sense of control. Emotional maturity also shapes how responsibility is shared. Long-term success requires both people to own their emotional impact. Apologies are offered without defensiveness. Repair is prioritized over being right. Needs are expressed clearly rather than hinted at or resented. This creates a rhythm of mutual care that sustains connection through stress, aging, and uncertainty. Age does not teach these skills. Practice and intention do.